Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
I think the reasons why African American families make the decision to leave the city is because of safety, policing, and education.
And you'll start to see institutions close. And initially you start to see it with grade schools. And we hear this conversation already. Schools closing in Missouri, in the St. Louis metropolitan. Where are the children? While the children aren't being born, we have fewer children today in the St. Louis metro region than we did 20 years ago.
For many years, STL's seen population numbers drop, and that trend continued in the year between July 2021 and June 2022. And the magnitude of resident loss in the city of St. Louis stood out among the report's numbers. What factors have contributed to that particular loss, and what's at play in overall decline in regional population? Joining me in studio to talk about it is Ness Sandoval, Professor of Demography and Sociology at St. Louis University and Acting Associate Director of the Taylor Geospatial Institute. Ness, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for inviting me today.
So let's talk first about the report that was released by the U.S. Census Bureau. What did that report indicate about the St. Louis region as a whole?
So the takeaway point is that the region lost population. This is an annual database that's released. Its components have changed, and so it's looking at births, deaths, international migration, and domestic migration. And so it's a very complicated story because every city has a different process of demographic change. But for the St. Louis metropolitan region, it's pointed out that we have a couple what we call demographic hurdles. The first hurdle is what we're in a demographic winter. And that means we have more people dying today than babies that are born. What happened is that COVID accelerated a demographic trend this was going to happen, but probably not till like 2035. But we're experiencing like this 15 years earlier now.
Okay.
And so once you get into these demographic winters, it's very difficult to get out, especially in the case of the St. Louis metropolitan region, because we have a very large baby boom population that the final demographic transition is mortality. And so that's coming.
Right.
And we just simply don't have enough babies being born to offset this next wave of high mortality rates.
So if there's a demographic winter, does that mean there's a demographic autumn? And if so, I mean, how long has this trend of decline been happening?
Well, fertility has been coming down. It's been coming down for the past decade. Actually, this is kind of an interesting point because things were looking good at the turn of the century. From 2000 to 2008, fertility in the United States was up. Things looked good, and then the Great Recession happened. And then fertility's just declined, and the economy recovered, but we never recovered demographically. And so St. Louis is one of these regions, and Missouri as a state has suffered demographically because fertility rates continue to decline. And the challenge here for the region is now if the region wants to grow, it is dependent on migration. And you never want to be dependent on migration for population growth.
And why is that?
Because you want to be able to grow based on natural growth.
Okay.
And so you want to be like Dallas. You want to be like Houston, where you have a lot of babies being born that you can grow. You're not dependent on people moving to your region. We now, as a region, are dependent on other people coming to St. Louis to make St. Louis their home, which is not a good thing because this is not true of every major. It's simply a handful of about 8 regions now.
Okay.
That are in a demographic winter.
And which other regions are we talking about here?
Well, Pittsburgh was the first region that went into a demographic winter. We're actually ranked number 5. behind, so it's Tampa, Cleveland, Detroit, and then St. Louis. And then we have Buffalo and Louisville and Providence.
Okay.
Those are the regions
Right.
where you have more people dying than being born. And so it's a very small subset. They're on the verge of going as well, but we need to think about what this means 20 years from now, because we can kind of see Pittsburgh's been in there for over a decade.
Right, right.
And it's getting worse each year for them.
Now, is there a particular point at which population decline gets officially recognized, as a winter or, as a problem? For instance, is there a certain number or a percentage of loss over time?
It's about the magnitude of the winter, and so I guess the question is it permanent or is it temporary? And so we know for some states it's permanent. West Virginia, New Hampshire, Maine, they will probably never get out of a demographic winter. Missouri's in a demographic winter. It may be permanent. I don't know. We don't know. We need a couple more years of data. But again, we don't have the age structure that necessarily is conducive to having lots of babies to offset the number of people who will be dying.
Sure. No, if we're in winter, what comes after that, and how soon are we looking at a situation where, we're past a point of no return, as it were?
We probably need 2 to 3 more years of data to get a sense. There's 2 processes in play. One is fertility, and if fertility continues to go down, that's going to make it more challenging. And then we have mortality, which we know is going to increase.
Right.
So the question of the point of no return is we can look at other countries, Japan, for example, and you'll start to see institutions close. And initially you start to see it with grade schools. And we hear this conversation already, schools closing in Missouri, in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Where are the children? While the children aren't being born, we have fewer children today in the St. Louis metro region than we did 20 years ago. And that's true for the state.
Yeah.
And so the numbers are still, the gap is still pretty small, but if that gap starts to widen, then there are questions about workforce in 20, 30 years from now. Are we going to be competitive? Will we actually have enough people for the jobs for St. Louis to be competitive economically? Those are the big questions. The questions are not necessarily about today or tomorrow, but 2024, 2050, St. Louis needs to be a competitive region, and we need population.
Now, you mentioned needing more data, and Casey from St. Louis has asked, many actions during the Trump administration, including the attempt to add a citizenship question, caused census data to be delayed, underfunded, and reduced public trust in the census. Has any of this or anything else from the Trump administration affected the quality of the data?
So we do know that for some states, the quality of the data did have an impact. So Texas, for example, there was an undercount. And so the impact for Texas is that they should have had one more House representative seat because of the undercount. But it's done. There's not much you can really do about it. The 2020 surveys, we always had a caution about what those numbers were about because of COVID. We're getting better data, more reliable data. The birth and deaths are fairly reliable because these are death certificates and birth certificates. So these are official documents.
So you had mentioned that 2008, at that point from the turn of the century, which is, it's kind of funny to be characterizing it that way, from 2000 to 2008, that there was growth happening. What was contributing to that growth?
I think there was a sense of optimism. People saw a future. People we want to have children. People were excited. I don't think we understood the magnitude of that demographic shock. That people thought the economy was over. Their dreams were over. And so the first thing you do is you stop having children.
Right, right.
And I think there was an assumption, a bad assumption, that once the economy recovered, people would go back and fertility rates would return. It never happened. Since 2008, fertility rates have been declining every single year.
And this is everywhere?
This is throughout the United States. We saw a small little bump, even after COVID, another demographic shock. a small little bump. It's not gonna come back. We can look at the data that's coming out, and it's having children today is very different than what was 20, 30 years ago. The cost, the co-pays, the affordability, the childcare. They're just the calculus is very different.
Right. I mean, how concerned should we be, and who's the we that's responsible for addressing it?
Well, it depends who we are, right? So if you're in Dallas and Houston, things are great. We call it's a demographic spring. Los Angeles, things are great. There are lots of babies being born. I think in Dallas, it's 111 babies, net babies, every day born with deaths. So in those cities, there's not an issue.
Right.
The issue is going to be in cities like Pittsburgh and St. Louis, where you have more people dying than being born. And then the question then, are people moving to the region? And the second part of that answer from the report last week was no. What happened last year was the largest out-migration, according to the population estimates, over the past decade for the St. Louis metropolitan region.
Wow.
So I was shocked by the magnitude of the number of people who left, because I was not expecting it to be the largest exodus of residents. But unfortunately, that's what happened.
Now, Twitter user X has written that the people and sense of community brought me back. The roads and trash in STL and extreme conservatives in the rest of the state are what makes me want to leave again. So this is a boomerang, it sounds like.
Sure.
What do you make of what's being mentioned here about the environment, not only the physical environment, but the political environment?
So this is a great question. I think everybody has their own calculus of why they move into the city or move into the suburbs, but we can look at other states. We can look at Nashville. We can look at Oklahoma City and Charlotte, and we can see that something demographically different. People are moving into those cities and not necessarily the city of St. Louis. The city of St. Louis actually, there's a lot of positive things that are happening, but it's the internal migration that's different than, they say, Baltimore or Pittsburgh, and that is you have white residents who are returning to the city. You have Black families who are leaving the city in large numbers. And this was there in the 2010 census. And we look 10 years later and we see that we've lost close to 5,000 Black households, but we've seen an increase of about 4,000 white households. And so now you have a white population that's larger than the Black population in the city of St. Louis. And parts of the city are thriving. But there are other parts where people are leaving, and that's why the city has a net loss. And we're going to see this when the numbers are released in September. We're going to continue to see a loss of Black families in the city. But for the first time, since we've been tracking this, we're seeing it for the region. That it's a small loss, but it should be of concern. That if you start losing your Black families in large numbers as a region, then it's going to be problematic to try to grow, to keep population going forward.
We'll pick up with that. We need to take a quick break. We'll be back shortly to continue this discussion. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. Before the break, you were talking about the loss of Black families in particular. And from what I understand, there are many Black families that have left the city of St. Louis and moved out to suburbs and maybe even as far as exurbs. What is driving that migration within the region?
I think there are at least two major drivers. The first has to do with safe neighborhoods, and the second is the quality of education. And I think when you look at, because we know exactly where the families are leaving, they're leaving, and it's highly correlated with where crime is happening, and it's highly correlated with the quality of schools.
And
so I think as a young mother, you want to create the best possible environment for opportunities, and it may not be parts of the city. It's in St. Louis County. It's in St. Charles County now, and so we are starting to see people look for opportunities out within our region. But we do have some families who are leaving the region altogether, and they're moving to other regions, Houston, Atlanta, Orlando. And so we need to keep a close eye on making sure that doesn't become a very significant loss of our population, as with the white residents, because we know that white residents have been leaving the region as well.
Now, one of the things that comes to mind as you're talking is, you said a mother. You're talking about safety. We're talking about education. So we're not just talking about individuals who are leaving. It's not just one person. We're talking about families.
This is a great point. So when we look at who's leaving, it's families, but we do have people moving into the city. And people who are moving into the city are individuals. We call them solos.
Okay.
And so the city of St. Louis is unique in this way because the majority of the households in the city now are solos, are not family households. And it's not a bad thing. It's happening throughout the United States, but the city itself is changing.
Right.
And to understand, like, it's losing its families. It's losing its children, but it's gaining younger people.
Right.
In the Central Corridor, it has more restaurants, more activities for that population.
So when you say younger, how young are we talking?
I would say between 20 and 35. But we're also seeing some empty nesters moving back into the city. The children are gone, and so they're coming back into the city to enjoy city life. Right? The city of St. Louis has a lot to offer for individuals and for families without children. When you have children, there's a different type of calculus that people have in terms of, is my child safe? Does my child have opportunity in education settings?
And that's something that I can personally relate to, in that when I was not a solo, but married without a child, and then when we were my partner and I were looking for somewhere to live, we didn't have options in the city because of the housing stock, because we would be living with parents, which means multi-generational, like finding a place that had a first floor bedroom, for example. To what extent is that kind of problem with the housing stock also part of the reason there are people choosing or forced to live somewhere outside the city rather than in it?
So I think that the housing stock is very important. But again, I think the issue is about the safety of the neighborhoods. And so if you have homes that are created but the neighborhoods are not safe, as a parent, you're still going to say, is my child going to be safe in this space? And so I think we see that Black families are leaving. And we picked this up in 2014 because there was a large exodus of families in 2014, and we would get phone calls like, "Do you know what's going on? Why so many people are moving out to the suburbs?" And so we can look at school data. So these I don't expect these trends to stop. They hopefully at some point. There'll be some leveling, but when we saw the new numbers, I was shocked, to be honest with you, that there was that many. That the estimate was under 290,
right?
Because it can get even further if we still have families leaving. If it's families, not individuals, then that number is going to be even larger next year.
And we did have a tweet from Julie who said that the change in households versus population and the changes in vacancy, without looking at those three metrics, a large part of the story is going to be untold. Household size is shifting in the city. And, there is an issue, too, with not talking about it. She said, we're barely talking about household size shift. We have another tweet from PJ who wrote that they moved to St. Louis to be closer to friends, family, culture. If something is going to be run me out of St. Louis, it's the slumlords / absentee landlords / speculators who the city is too cowardly to crack down on. So this is getting to some structure and governance. And we've also gotten some tweets and Facebook posts that have to do with this safety question and what the city is doing. We just had an election. There are new people who have come in. It has been touted sort of as a progressive sweep. Do you think that that change in politics, that can help bring people back in, including some of the Black families that have left?
I don't think so. I talked to lots of people, and what's interesting is that there's a paradox here, because there are lots of babies born in the city of St. Louis. It's St. Charles and St. Louis City are not in a demographic winter, these two counties. But what happens is that once the child's born, the families move out to the suburbs. I've met one family that moved from the suburbs into the city once the child was born. It's typically 99% the other way. But I do see lots of single people moving into the city. And so that's what's, I think, unique about this city, is that there are people moving in. But it's not the way we look at other cities like Baltimore. We look at some pure cities like Baltimore, Memphis, Charlotte. African Americans are moving into the city. And so we have that's the trend that should be concerning, is that we're starting to deviate from our peers. When we just talk about the city of St. Louis, we're deviating pretty significantly, where whites are moving in, but the Black population's leaving. And that's not happening in our peer cities.
Tamara from St. Louis, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, Elaine. Thank you for having me. Congratulations on your voice on the radio.
Oh, thank you.
So I just wanted to join the conversation as I listen to you and Professor Sandoval. So I'm a wife of a family of 5. Our eldest child wasn't born here but grew up here. So specifically when Dr. Sandoval talks about 99% of the families who have had babies moving the other way from the city to the county, I can just say that for my husband and I, we have made a very political decision to stay into the city. But I could definitely understand African American families making that choice, because we have a property and we're intentional about living in North St. Louis to live close to our mosque. But I'd have to say in about 2018, while our family slept, 3 bullets entered our home as we slept. 1 bullet actually entered our children's home in between the top and bottom bunk where 2 of my children slept. And calling the police wasn't an option, because at the time, we'd done that before and encountered backlash from the illegal elements in our community. So I think the reasons why African American families make the decision to leave the city is because of safety, crime and safety, and policing and education. So, now with the new police chief, I hope to see improvements in that area. Educationally, we've had success. Our eldest is a graduate of St. Louis Public, particularly one of the magnet schools in the city, Collegiate School of Medicine and Bioscience, which unfortunately faced their own violence recently with the school shooting, but she's now a junior in college. But I can say that for my husband and I, we bought a second property in July of 2020 and left the north of the city intentionally to protect the safety of our children. But we chose to stay in the city and now live in Ellendale, which is just out of the central corridor, and have found far more resources there in terms of just shopping.
Thank you, Tamara. So what she has been talking about very much aligns with what you're saying. And we also have people such as David on Twitter who've said, unless something is done to address the criminal activity, I'm out. So
it is. I think when you start to look at our peer cities, and we look at it's the level of crime, but it's the concentration of crime in certain geographical areas that's different. So when you compare ourselves to Boston, we compare ourselves to Cleveland, it's the structural inequality that's getting reflected spatially. And I think a lot of people, when they go to Houston, they go to Dallas, they're like, the spatial inequality does not exist at the level it does here in St. Louis. And this has been around for several decades. This is not a new issue. I think what's new is that people are starting to say, I'm willing to move.
Yeah, right. Well, clearly there is much more to talk about, and I hope that we do get to do that in the future. Ness Sandoval is professor of demography and sociology at St. Louis University. He is also the acting associate director of the Taylor Geospatial Institute. Thank you for having this important conversation with us today.
Thank you very much.
This segment was produced by Elaine Cha.
With audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our production intern is Avery Rogers.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.